All right. Hello, everyone. Today is going to be lesson 8 on behavioral health, and today we're talking about memory. This is actually chapter 9 of the textbook, and we're going over the first two sections types of memory as well as types of long term memory. In the third section, which will be in the next video, we'll talk about the organization of long term memory in the brain, but we'll save that for another day. Anyways, let's get started. So, memory is a part of information processing. It's not an isolated thing, right? It exists within a continuum of cognitive processes, which begins with attention to something, the sensation of this thing, perception, and learning, right? And then higher up, we have memory, but then after that, we have thinking as well as problem solving, which allows us to have language and intelligent behavior. That's what's so unique about humans, is the fact that we can move along bidirectionally um, through this information processing continuum, which is what creates bottom up and top down processing, right? So, for example, you have if you have a dog, right? You can pay attention to the dog and you can feel it, you can perceive it. You can also learn about this type of dog for the first time, and then you can figure out through this dog being hidden in an optical illusion. If you already know what this dog is and you already know about the species, then you can use this knowledge for problem solving, and that's basically the concept of the information processing continuum and where memory is placed in that process. Now, there are three steps to memory, right? We have encoding, which can be compared to a computer, right? For example, when you have keystrokes, it needs to convert it to binary. When there's sound coming into the microphone, as I'm talking right now, it needs to transduce that stimuli into, well, not stimuli, it needs to transduce those sound waves into binary, similar to how our sensory systems transduce stimuli into neural signals. So basically, encoding is the acquiring and transferring of information into memory early on. And storage is actually retaining this information over time. It varies from very, very brief memory called sensory memory to indefinite, which is like long-term memory, which we'll talk about later. Actually, unfortunately, though, unlike computers, human memory is reconstructive and prone to errors and distortions. Finally, we have retrieval, which is the phenomenon of accessing stored information. The failure to retrieve can occur due to interference or stress. For example, when you're reviewing for a test, you might get all of the multiple choice questions right. You might know all of the content and have it very close to heart, and yet when you're actually in the exam center, your performance level might decrease because of your stress, right? Okay, so next we have benefit of memory and its contributions in terms of evolution. So memory helps organisms use past information to coordinate their present behavior. It creates a key survival advantage for some species because it means that they can more quickly respond to things like prey, and they can be the first to get potential food. There is evidence that memory does take up energy, so there is a compromise to be found. Organisms only develop higher level memory if it helps them and results in a net positive. Essentially, what they did is they created a situation where they could get fruit flies to die as quickly as possible. But who would actually end up dying first? First, they classically conditioned fruit flies to be scared of an odor because they would pair that odor with an electric shock. Now, this electric shock is not fatal. However, the flies, well, which were not able to eat food and had no water, who did memorize, took up more of their energy and hence actually died 4 hours earlier. than the non-memory forming flies. So there is this adaptive trade-off, right? And so the survival benefits, as I said, must outweigh the energy costs. For example, this is important for squirrels because they ought to remember where they placed the acorns in the last season when they come to retrieve it in the spring. There are various models of memory, and we'll be talking about the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. Essentially, the information flows through a series of stages, and if it's not transferred to the next stage, then you lose it, right? Forgetting is a process that can happen through the stage of sensory memory and short term memory. And the only way you can convert short term memory to long term memory is through rehearsal. This includes control processes, right? So there are active strategies that can help age your memory, like repetition, which is a part of rehearsal. Now, there are some modifications of this model by some scientists, and the control processes influence memory function. For example, we can take the ability to memorize a phone number through, and we can take that through these various stages until it is permanently imprinted in our minds. And I'll use that example a couple of times in this lesson. So step one, sensory memory. It's the first stage where you can briefly hold large amounts of sensory data. There are three types of codes which will persist throughout. The first is iconic, which stores images and fades quickly. When I look at the slide that I'm using as a reference for my speaking, if I close my eyes, I will quickly lose the detail in my mind about what the slide actually looked like. However, let's compare that to acoustic, which stores sounds and lasts slightly longer. So if I'm in conversation with someone and I'm not actually paying attention to them, I can actually still go back a few seconds and try to pick up the sound that they were making with their mouths, and then taking the meaning and trying to make out what the words that they were saying through that. It's why you might say, "Oh, can you repeat that again?" in a conversation, and then realize that you didn't need the other person to repeat their words in the first place. And finally, we have haptic, which processes touch. Now, there is this scientist whose name is Sperling, and he demonstrated how brief sensory memory actually was through letter matrices. First, he showed the matrix, the first experiment, which wasn't quite about sensory memory yet. He showed an entire matrix of letters, and he would ask participants to recall it, right? It would be a sudden flash, and then the matrix was gone. And the participants would be able to say, let's say, like one line, one row, all right? And the participants were complaining. They were like, but Sperling, I remember the other rows. I could have remembered them, but I forgot them while I was telling you the first row. So he then did another experiment where if where he would show the matrix, the entire matrix, but if a high tone was played, you have to recall the first row. If a middle tone was created, then you'd have to recall the middle row, etc. And what happened was, as he extended, well, first of all of the participants were able to successfully, uh, uh, they were able to successfully pick up and memorize the rows that they were asked to call out. But as the duration of time between the flash of the matrix and showing and ringing the tone increased, they would forget they would forget all of the letters in the meantime, which demonstrates how short sensory memory actually is. So ultimately, the purpose isn't to store information for a really long time. It's just so we can collect data until enough meaning is gathered from all of these separate pieces, and this meaning is formed for further processing. Step two is short-term memory, which requires utmost attention because all of the stimuli from the uh, from sensory memory will be competing for the attention. But if you want for it to go into your short-term memory, it ought to have your complete attention. The encoding types are the same: acoustic for sound, visual means image, and semantic is the meaning of words. Acoustic codes are often responsible for errors. For example, if I memorize the letter P through an acoustic code by memorizing the sound, when I recall it later, I might say that the letter was B because of how similar it sounds. And yet, the encoding process often involves almost instantaneously switching from visual to acoustic, right? This is quite intuitive. But then you might ask, how can we prove that visual codes are still there? What if it's just acoustic from the beginning? Well, it's obviously present because we've done study with maps and participants are still able to recall the shapes of various landforms on the map, even though you can't convert that to an acoustic code, can you? And finally, word meanings, right? Semantic code helps with encoding significantly. We can talk about this consonant triplet experiment, which is kind of similar to the thing with the letter matrix. But I'll talk about it more on the next slide. But it also shows how short-term memory is. It's very easily disrupted, and so the estimate is that the longest estimated duration for short-term memory is actually only 30 seconds. Rehearsal is where you go through the information over and over again, and the capacity for short-term memory, which you'll have to memorize, according to Miller, is 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information, whereas for the psychologist Cohen, he proposed this value of 4. Now, if it's so small, what's the purpose of short-term memory? Well, it's actually beneficial how small the capacity is because it allows us to avoid excessively burdening our memory capacities. And if the expanding of short-term memory is desired, you can chunk the pieces. Essentially, if you're trying to remember a phone number, for example, you can memorize it in terms of groups of numbers of 3, 3, and then 4, instead of memorizing each individual number. Because by doing so, you're actually increasing the size of the bit. So, yeah, this is the triplet consonant experiment, uh, which was conducted by these two brothers, I believe, called last name Peterson. And the participants were given triplets of letters like XPG or BTP. What happened was, as time increased, they started their ability to retain the order of the letters and the letters themselves decreased, which and ultimately it seemed to all fade away at the margin of 18 seconds. But the funny thing about this experiment is that the participants were informed beforehand that they would need to recall a triplet series of letters. So there are some psychologists which think that this experiment is inaccurate and that short-term memory is actually even shorter. Had these part would it would have been even shorter had the participants not known that they would have to recall the letters in the first place, which is more true to the actual definition of short term memory. Now, we have this extension of the concept of short term memory called working memory, which is where you can actively manipulate information and manage multiple types of information. Now, the difference is in this passiveness of short term memory versus the activeness of working memory. If you ask your friend whether or not they can study with you on Tuesday or Thursday night next week, they might say, "No, Tuesday doesn't work for me. Can we meet on Wednesday instead?" The fact that you can process this sentence as a whole means that you're using working memory because in short-term memory, all of those are in separate pieces, but you have to be able to process multiple memory tasks simultaneously in order to memorize that, in order to understand that sentence. And working memory, the proposed model is, well, there are this visual spatial sketchpad, an episodic buffer, and a phonological loop. The phonological loop is visual and auditory. For example, repeating your friend's phone number over and over while trying to remember it while you're looking for your own phone. The visual spatial sketchpad is intuitively visual and spatial. The central executive directs attention to each component to successfully do tasks and adapt, and the episodic buffer allows stuff from your long term memory to help your working memory. I have an example on the next page, which is this series of consonants. It, if you did not have an episodic buffer, it would be very hard to memorize this series of letters fast because you wouldn't know that the FBI stands for something, the IRS stands for something, etc., etc. You need your episodic buffer, which takes information from your long term memory and helps you memorize stuff for your working memory. Some neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex is responsible for central executive tasks. Patients with prefrontal cortex damage will struggle with quickly adapting to new rules, right? They're unable to use all the parts of their memory together. They're struggling to use visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop episodic buffer together, which the central executive is controlling, which is why they will which is why they will struggle to adapt to the new rules. The prefrontal cortex is important for working memory in general. Infants are able to create a mental representation of hidden toys starting at 8 months old, and lo and behold, their prefrontal cortexes are developed during this time, right? Before 8 months old, if you hid a toy away from them, they'd forget about the toy instantly and they wouldn't want it. They'd only want the toy if they saw the toy. And the last stage is long term memory, which has few limitations in capacity and duration. It's said to be infinite. It has various levels of processing that are involved with making information go from working memory into long term memory. Maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal are two types, and the second one is better because of this thing called levels of processing. Elaborative rehearsal is actually thinking about the meaning of things, right? For example, if you memorize a word by the fact that it has a capital letter in it, well, you're not going to get very far. You're going to forget it very soon. If it rhymes with another word, maybe that'll help more. But ultimately, if you put the word into a sentence, you'll memorize what word you were trying to find for quite a long time. And that's basically elaborative rehearsal. Now, there's a difference between working on long term memory, and we can prove this through the serial position effect. If you're asked to recall words in a 20 long list, the primacy effect gives you more time for rehearsal and storage into long term memory for words early on in the list, and that is permanent. The recency effect is the fact that the words that are last in the list are still in your working memory when you're asked to recall the words, right? And remember, 30 seconds is the length of time, maximum length of time. And this is a diagram that shows with the U shape. Now, basically, the difference between working memory and long-term memory is the fact that for the primacy effect, it stays, but because of long-term memory. But the recency effect is gone once you wait for more than 30 seconds. The U will start to look just like a downward decline. And finally, we can also distinguish them through case studies. One could stay intact while the other is damaged. Famously, Henry Molaison could remember information for a few seconds, but he couldn't store it in his long-term memory. He could have whole entire conversations as long as people didn't intentionally mess with him and pause for long durations of time. This other patient called KF had a functional ability to form new long-term memories but struggled to recall digits shown in front of him. And he would only be able to memorize one or two, which is much less than the estimated 7 plus or minus 2 range. It also has a difference in the roles of codes. Long-term memory provides semantic codes while working, and short-term prioritizes auditory and visual. For example, if a professor specifically words something in such a beautiful manner that the student wants the professor to re-articulate it, the student will successfully and temporarily memorize the sound of the sentence that the professor made. But ultimately, when he's walking out of the lecture room, what he's going to memorize is not the sound anymore, which was in the working memory, but in the long term memory, he's going to remember the substance, the meaning of the words that was said. So, this is just a review screenshot of all the stuff we covered in the first section, and now I have 9 minutes for the second section. Let's see if I can get through this. Types of long-term memory, right? This is quite a conclusive chart. First, we have declarative and non-declarative, which declarative includes semantic and episodic, which combines to create autobiographical memory, and non-declarative has procedural, classical conditioning, which we've already learned about, and priming. Declarative versus non-declarative. Declarative is easy to discuss verbally, is very conscious and effortfully accessed, whereas non-declarative memory is hard to explain through words. It affects our behavior, though, subconsciously and indirectly. Now we'll talk about semantic and episodic memory, which is part of declarative memory. Semantic is straight facts and general knowledge. It's organized in categories. We have a category in our brain, let's say for birds, for other types of animals, for specific units in our courses. And it results from information provided by others. And it gives us an objective understanding of the world, whereas episodic memory is for specific accounts of events, people, and objects, and it's organized in a timeline resulting from personal past experiences. And it's a reference point for our subjective experiences of the self. Autobiographical memories interact dynamically to give a complete picture of the past. You can either get knowledge by, say, learning it from a class, for example, discovering that the equator is hot, or observing the phenomenon directly by going to Mexico. Furthermore, we use semantic knowledge as a framework to understand our episodic memories. Right? So it's kind of a correlated relationship. And this blending creates autobiographical memories, factual, which is basically the factual semantic aspects of personal experiences going back to the equator is hot and therefore Mexico is on average warmer than Canada, example. And it's accessed from two ways. You can either relive it very vividly from a personal vantage point if the autobiographical memory was something that was recent, and you could also observe it from the sidelines, which is true for autobiographical memories in the more distant past. They appear to be very easily stored compared to other semantic memories like coursework. And ultimately, we guess that the purpose is that it helps us respond to current challenges of life because it organizes our experience such that we can reuse our past solutions to obstacles. It also creates a sense of continuity in the self and helps us with social bonds with others, right? How you would interact with one person versus the other, versus a friend versus a distant rendezvous versus a stranger. Non declarative memories, put in words, is basically being able to do something without knowing how you're doing it. It characterizes difficult to put in words and unconscious memories, right? So that's non declarative memories for you. There's three types: classical conditioning, procedural memory, and priming. I'll talk about priming in this slide. Essentially, if you're exposed to stimulus, it can change your response to subsequent related stimulus. Before you're being interviewed by someone, if a random person comes up to you and starts to say random slurs to you, you'll be more agitated, and even if you don't notice it, when you're being interviewed, you might start to interrupt the interviewer at a higher rate, which was an experiment done in 1996. Classical conditioning is learning that a stimulus signals an important upcoming event. It probably accounts for involuntary and unconscious emotional responses to our environment, for example, being scared of the dentist or having stage fright. This is Glenn Gould, a famous pianist who is notorious for canceling his concerts at the last minute because of stage fright. In fact, he retired from his live performance career probably because of this and how much he despised the stage. Procedural memories help us carry out motor procedures. For example, when you're driving, when you're first learning, you'll have to memorize that the accelerator is on the right, the brake is on the left. Whereas once you actually know what you're doing, you start to think about more important things like potential threats on the road, etc., which helps us automate our performance. And priming is, let's say, even if you don't remember seeing an ad beforehand, if you see the ad again, you'll probably have a more positive impression of it. You'll receive it more well. There are two types of priming: perceptual, which is item specific, and conceptual priming, which is the impact of meaning. It explains how information is organized in the long term memory, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. Okay, so perceptual priming is basically where so this example is where if you're shown an object that is possible to exist in the real world, you'll be able to recall it easier later on. Whereas if you're shown an impossible object, it won't really help to see it beforehand. You'll still struggle to recall that this is something that you've seen beforehand. This was an experiment that was done. So there's no priming for impossible objects, whereas there is for possible objects. And conceptual priming, which is meaning related, right? So in this experiment, you say yes if both words that are given to you are real. However, your time between your getting the words and your response will decrease significantly if the words themselves are related, which demonstrates the impact of conceptual priming. Long-term memory in the brain. The relationship present in activity and specific brain components are related to long-term memory, and you can support distinctions made between the explicit and implicit memories because of neuroscience. The hippocampus supports consolidation of info into long-term memory. We know this thanks to Henry Molaison, who lost tissue in the inner part of his temporal lobes in both hemispheres. He retained most of his memories leading up to the surgery, but couldn't form new ones, which is interrogated amnesia. Remember that term, please. He couldn't transfer information about people, places, events, and numbers into his long-term memory, and yet his working memory was fine. His procedural memory was also fine. And yet he did not remember learning nor doing any tasks which he had picked up, like learning a new instrument. He could go to the lesson, forget about the lesson, and still be able to do the thing. The circuits that connect the hippocampus and temporal lobe with the cortex ultimately participate in long-term memory formation. Declarative memories in the cerebral cortex. Semantic and episodic and autobiographical involve the participation of this brain part. Semantic is widely distributed across. For example, naming animals activates occipital lobe activity because we have to visualize it. Naming tools activates the frontal and parietal lobe because it's associated with movement and the action word, let's say banging the hammer or like smashing it or something. Episodic is affected by damage to the prefrontal cortex. Source amnesia is where you can have semantic knowledge without knowing the source of it. And autobiographical is most widely distributed because you need to combine perceptual, emotional, and factual detail. Right? So this shows the difference between various types of semantic memory. And this shows the difference between perceiving autobiographical details versus listening to someone else's life story. Procedural memories and the basal ganglia. It's responsible for motor systems of the brain. Huntington's and Parkinson's is the degeneration of the basal ganglia, which causes difficulty in picking up new procedures. Declarative memories, though, remain intact. Remember, Henry Molaison was the opposite. And yeah. So this is a summary of what we've learned so far. We have semantic memory and episodic memory. There's general knowledge for semantic memory, but also it's organized by category. Episodic is personal history and organized chronologically. The autobiographical memory is declarative and explicit and combines prefrontal, sensory, and motor cortex, and non-declarative is difficult to verbalize and easy to demonstrate, and is responsible, and the basal ganglia is responsible for this. Now, okay, I did rush a bit of the last portion of this lesson. If you do have any comments, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll happily answer them. And yeah, see you next time where we'll talk about the organization of long-term memory in the brain. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and see you next week. Bye.